So I am doing my presentation for my literature review paper for Sarah Olin. My presentation is on conflict in healthcare. So I wrote my paper on conflict in healthcare, and I decided to do this topic because I just knew that there is a lot of conflict in healthcare, and I know that it's everywhere and you can't avoid it. And just having tools that are helpful to resolve conflict is super important. And regardless of where you go, regardless of profession or even if you're in healthcare or not, knowing how to handle conflict is very important. So what is conflict, or what is conflict in healthcare, and what does it look like? Conflict is a disagreement or an argument. It's usually with another person, but it can be an internal conflict. Conflict can range from big disputes that require lawyers and involvement such as that, or it can be just really small things like what you want to have for dinner. But conflict affects efficiency, confidence, self-reliance, self-esteem, and morale, just to name a few things in the workplace that it can affect. It can also affect personal relationships as well. In healthcare, it can lead to increased turnover rates, and overall can just affect patient care negatively. And that is the main point that I've found through this paper and doing research. It can happen Conflict can happen between patients and nurses, or patients and any healthcare staff, or even between doctors and nurses and another nurse. It can happen between any healthcare professionals. There are several different types of conflict. Individual, interpersonal, and organizational conflict are the three main ones that I focused on. Individual is conflict within oneself. So that can be misinterpreting actions within other individuals, but it can also, conflict within oneself can affect your motives, your worldviews, and your abilities can be distorted. It just affects the person personally, and that can therefore affect your performance in the workplace as well. Interpersonal, the communication is the main cause of conflict in that. Communication between coworkers or with the patient. Having really good communication with your patient is one way to avoid that. But power and dehumanization are also parts that play in conflict, for interpersonal conflict. So the one statistic that I found was 16 studies addressed low degree of support by colleagues or supervisors where interpersonal interactions lacked recognition, mutual trust, fairness, or transparency. And so it just shows that interpersonal interactions are very important in the workplace. Organizational conflict concerns itself with workflow and procedures. This mainly happens in the workplace. Not usually, I would say, outside of it. A large source of this in healthcare can just be ambiguity in hospital standards and policies. When there's vagueness or confusion in any sort of hospital policy or such as that, it can be a big source of conflict, because those are set in place to prevent confusion in the first place. When there is organizational conflict, people will experience job dissatisfaction, they will want to leave their job, and turnover rates are higher. And because of all of those, quality of patient care is lower again. They affect the patient's time in the hospital regardless of how long they're there. So organizational factors are really important to keep in place, and good ones to keep in place while in the workplace. How do we handle conflict? Well, the best thing to do is prevent it before it happens. So the person I interviewed, she said that the way she tries to do it is just keep a positive work environment and ask if anybody has any concerns right up front or immediately, regularly, so that she can prevent it before there are any really big issues. But just knowing what each employee's standard is and what the standards are for the company will help to prevent conflict in the first place. But we know that conflict cannot always be prevented. So when it is, it's best practice just to resolve it quickly. So one thing you do need to take into account, though, is to look at conflict styles. Everybody has a different conflict styles. They're one of the 5: avoiding, accommodating, compromising, competing, and collaborating. And so it's important to take into account which of those might the people on your team have if you're in a position of leadership, and to know who would bring concerns up and who wouldn't. Typically, people who are avoiding won't really bring up conflict at all. They will not, they'll just try to delay it or just walk away from it, and they don't want to bring up anything that could cause tension. Accommodating is they usually want to ignore what they want, and they will accommodate what the other person wants and give into that. Compromising, they will try and negotiate and find a middle ground. But competing they're highly assertive, and they will just fight until they get what they want, but they are usually not negotiable. Collaborating is the best way to handle conflict, and there are a lot of factors that go into this, but finding something that will work for both people and finding a middle ground is the best way to do that. So we know that conflict can't be avoided, but there's no way around it. It happens in every work environment, it happens everywhere, but finding the best ways to prevent it or to resolve it in the best way when it does happen is best practice.